Hello again, and it's chapter 4, Into the Depths. The following dawn was very different from the one that had just passed, as if to reflect the changing mood. The sky barely lightened, and baleful clouds hung low over the land. Cold, soaking rain fell in wind-driven gusts, and the ground was damp and sodden and slippery. It was a grim party that set out behind Scaife towards the mire. The 14 remaining Geats were joined by the same group of Danish warriors who had helped with the defence against Grendel, with one addition. To my amazement, as we were ready to leave, another horse appeared round the corner of the hall. Astride it, a trifle the worse for a drink, but looking warrior-like and grim none the less, was Unfer. A round shield strapped to his chest, and a huge sword strapped to his back. "No fuss, boy," he growled at me as he passed to join the column of horsemen. "It's too crabby and foul a morning for banter and wordplay." Beowulf, at the head of the raiders, swung his horse around to identify the newcomer. He saw Unferth, nodded and smiled a distinctive smile that wasn't a smile. That done, he wheeled around once more, and the column set off. It took scarcely any time to reach the fringes of the mire, but crossing that foul place was slow going on horseback. The horses would lose their footing and half slip into stagnant, stinky pools. Odd sounds would reach us out of the mist and startle our mounts, croakings and hissings and noises suggestive of creatures better left unseen. The trees and shrubs in that place were odd, contorted and stunted and covered with a brackish slime. Even in the cold, the mire made us sweat under our cloaks, and the cloying smell of damp vegetation coated the nostrils and made our heads ache. It was a relief when the damp lands gave way to the dunes that heralded the coastline. It had taken only half a day to reach this place, but the horses looked as though they'd travelled for twice as long, and even the most seasoned warriors among us were glad to be clear of the mire. The dunes were sandy, mixed with rocks and tufts of hardy grass, and the footing was difficult for the horses, but they moved with a spring in their step, sensing the journey's end in the tangy sea air. We halted at a signal from Scaife, and the horses were tethered on the stubby grass. One Eye led us across the last stretch of dunes to a small point where the stream that ran through the mire created a waterfall. Beowulf looked at Scaife. Scaife shrugged his shoulders and pointed to the churning waters in the large pool below the fall. "In there?" Beowulf asked incredulously. "Yep," confirmed Scaife, "but let me show you something else." Ropes were called for and tied to two of the strongest horses. Beowulf and Scaife lowered themselves over the cliff's edge and dropped some 40 feet below the top. When they reappeared, Beowulf shook his head and smiled at his friend, clapping him on the back. "Scaife has seen a cave," he called to the rest of us, "way down just below the water line. You can't see it from here, but it is there." "Sad Scaife see it?" I asked, raising an eyebrow at the enigmatic warrior. "Because I looked for it," One Eye answered. The beast was heading home, that much was clear. She plunged off the cliff into the water, and I could not conceive of any reason why she would kill herself, so I assumed she was continuing her journey home. Nothing about her physiognomy suggested she could breathe underwater, so I guessed there must be a dwelling place of sorts below the pool below. One of the warriors gave a low whistle to show he was impressed. I nodded in agreement. "Brains to go with bravery, Scaife," I said, smiling at One Eye. "A dangerous combination." Scaife shrugged his shoulders again. Beowulf laughed at his phlegmatic friend, and then his expression turned serious. "My friends, I thank you for accompanying me, but from here I must go on alone." As the warriors, both Danish and Geat, began to protest, Scaife interrupted. "How long can any one of you hold your breath underwater?" he barked, The cave is a long way below the higher level of the pool. To climb down would be impossible. The only way to reach the cave is to swim down. The only man with lungs big enough to make the swim is Beowulf. He must go alone. There was silence. No one would admit it, but mixed in with the guilt of having to leave the onus of the battle with our leader once again was a sense of relief that they didn't have to undertake what could be a suicidal mission. The ropes were hauled up and repositioned close to the head of the fall. Beowulf prepared to enter the water. Scaife handed him a cloth soaked in oil to coat his arms and legs. It would protect him against the cold. Beowulf looked at the weapons strapped to his horse. He turned, frowning. "Is there any benefit taking a sword?" he asked aloud, though the question was for himself. "There may be one. There may be in this one," replied a voice. Unferth had unstrapped the huge blade across his back and offered it to Beowulf. "This was given to me many years ago by a wise man I met on my travels far to the south of here." "A generous gift, Unferth," replied Beowulf, "but I could never swim carrying this, and no sword can harm these creatures." Okay, look, you can see it now. There's the mire. There's the pool. Okay, and then they all stood on the rock at the top. "This is no ordinary wise man, Lord Beowulf," said Unferth with a knowing smile. "This is no ordinary blade." He drew the blade from its scabbard, and there was a murmur of approval from the onlooking warriors. Instead of the dull metal of most blades, this had a sheen to it like a polished gemstone. The murmurs turned to cries of astonishment when Unferth flipped the sword in the air as if it were a child's toy and caught it again after it turned a lazy, graceful circle in the air. He offered it again to Beowulf, who reached for it, eyes wide with excitement. He held the sword up and looked along its length. "Perfect," he breathed. He paused and looked at Unferth, a notion of suspicion in his glance. "Why, Unferth?" he asked, puzzled at the old warrior's change of heart. "There was once a warrior like you," replied Unferth cryptically. "He was considered one of the finest warriors in the Danelands, head and shoulders above other fighters. Everyone praised him and roared their approval at his deeds until he grew vain and proud. His vanity made him lazy, and he lived on tales of his deeds rather than new deeds. And he began to hate himself and call himself a coward. He became bitter and a shadow of the man he once was. An old man now, when he sees young warriors at the height of their power, he feels shame and guilt and says harsh things to mask his feelings. He would have you know that you are the finest he has seen." Beowulf didn't reply. Instead, he took a pace forward and grasped the older man in a fierce clasp. He drew back and looked at Unferth in the eye. "The weak ones sit at home, waiting on the news, Unferth. Only the boldest and most courageous followed me here." Soon Beowulf stood at the edge of the cliff, his watery destiny below him. Without a backward glance, he grasped the rope and lowered himself over. The rope fell short of a pool by a few feet, and Beowulf had to drop into the freezing waters. He didn't hesitate. We saw the last heave of his shoulders as he drew a deep breath into those gargantuan lungs, and then he fell. She saw him enter the water, her eyes accustomed to the murky blue-black depths. His movements were strong and purposeful, betraying none of the fear these creatures usually showed. She knew in her heart that this was her son's killer, and her thirst for revenge. And she thirsted for revenge. The sea serpents with which she shared the scraps of her kills moved to intercept the warrior, but she knew they would be no match for his courage and his keen blade. He battled his way through the monsters. She could see his face now, strong and proud, even with the strain of holding his breath. The blood of the serpents added a purplish ichor to the waters, and she lost sight of the warrior momentarily. The hag peered into the gloom, searching for a sign of the warrior's approach. Not daring to hope that he might have fallen to the serpents, she sensed him, rather than saw the movement to her left, as he hauled himself from the water into the cave. He was cunning as well as strong and brave. There was a silence as the warrior rested patiently, drawing the air back into his lungs. She crouched lower, feigning sleep as he approached from the far side of the opening. She heard him take a few paces back to avoid being seen, and heard the hiss of his breath as the dim sunlight caught the interior of the cave. The bones and carcasses of her kills decked the floor. The hag grinned fiercely to herself as she realized the warrior must have recoiled at the sight of his friends. She heard him exhale again, softly composing himself, and then again came the soft tread of cautious feet on the stone floor. He was close now, and he paused. She knew he must be unsheathing his blade, and felt for her own concealed in her lap. She felt the breath of air as the warrior rushed the last few steps, heard the sweep of the sword, and exulted at the grunt of surprise as her weapon came up as swift as a darting fish to catch his killing stroke. She was on her feet with remarkable speed and aimed a kick at the off-balance fighter. Another grunt of surprise as she caught him in the midriff made her cackle with excitement. The warrior had clearly not expected her to carry a weapon, but he learned his lesson quickly as he rolled to miss the backhanded slash she aimed at his head. She was between him and his sword now. She closed, baring her dagger-like teeth and flexing her claws. She would make this slow. He would suffer, just like her Grendel. She would hobble him with a deft slash at the knee. She snarled in fury as her cut was intercepted, and the warrior grasped her knife arm. Before she could bring her teeth and claws into play, she felt herself seized in a bear hug, the breath whooshing from her. He had spirit. This would be a fine kill. No one bore witness to the mighty struggle that took place in that cave. The indestructible monster against the irresistible courage of a hero. Up on the surface, we waited for what seemed like hours. We waited at first with expectation, then with hope. As the shadows drew in and the daylight waned, our hope turned to fear. No one looked at each other. Instead, eyes were cast down and shoulders sagged. Scaife lowered himself on the rope, but reported no sign of movement at the entrance to the cave. The Danes among our group lost heart, and they left us heavy-hearted on the cliff top. The 13 Geats and Unferth and I will never desert a man who carries that sword, for it has never failed to find its mark, snarled the grizzled old warrior when Danes questioned why he stayed. After more waiting, a sorry sight met our eyes. As we stared into the darkening pool below, the water slowly began to change colour. Dark swirls of rusty water appearing amidst the fresh and clear. Wakeman saw the stains in the water and turned to us with grief in his eyes. That is blood, he said. I don't know whether to show you the next picture. If you don't like scary images, turn away now. Okay, I've turned it off. I'm going to finish the chapter. I, replied Scaife, but whose? Without another word, One Eye swung himself over the cliff's edge using the same rope that Beowulf had used. Sensing a purpose in my cunning comrade, I persuaded the Geats to tie up another rope, and I lowered myself alongside Scaife. We hung there, hovering a few weak feet above the water, peering into the depths. After a few moments that seemed an age of man, Scaife shouted to me and pointed at the water. Amidst the churning dark patches in the water, a series of bubbles was rising to the surface. The bubble activity increased, reaching a crescendo of froth and fury, shortly before an arm shot out of the water, clutching something that resembled a brown sack. Beowulf's body followed the hand, coughing and spluttering and shaking the sack at us. Scaife wrapped his legs around the thick rope and flipped upside down, holding his hands out to Beowulf. Beowulf, still fighting for breath, slung the brown sack in my direction and forced himself upward out of the water to cling to Scaife's outstretched hands. I caught the sack, looked up, and bellowed to the jeets on the cliff. "Pull!" I yelled, but my words were lost on the blustery winds above the churning pool. Fortunately, the jeets had seen everything, and strong hands grasped at the ropes and hauled us to the top of the cliff. Beowulf lay, gasping for breath, and flapping his hand in my direction, while Scaife frantically rubbed some feeling back into his aching arms. Concerned, I seized Beowulf's hand. "Head!" he spluttered, in between spitting out mouthfuls of water onto the headland. I frowned, not understanding. "Head!" he spluttered indignantly, waving in the direction of the sack he'd thrown at me. I picked up the sack, shouted, and dropped it again. Unforth picked it up and immediately began to laugh. He held it up for the others to see and shook it in my face, grinning. The sack was the head of Grendel himself, leering in a hideous death grin, brown and wrinkled and covered in sparse hair, like a sack. The laughter broke the tension. Soon all the warriors were rolling around on the ground in merriment and relief, among them Beowulf, no longer spluttering, exhausted but alive. Beowulf's tale of the fight with Grendel's mother came later, back at Harrow, with food and warmth had brought colour back into the hero's cheeks. The monster had been strong beyond anything Beowulf had experienced. He wrestled with her for an age, the cruel point of her dagger inching ever closer to him. There was nothing to brace himself against as he had done when tearing off Grendel's arm, and no weapon to ward off the blow he knew would come. Out the corner of his eye he could see Unferth's obsidian blade lying on the floor behind the hag. Somehow he had to reach it. His strength was failing. The strain on his muscles from the swim was telling, and he could feel the hag's breath in his face as she slowly forced his arm back and her dagger closer. They say in desperation men can do extraordinary things. Beowulf barely remembered how, but he had summoned one last burst of energy and hurled the monster away. She howled in anger and leapt back to attack, but the brief respite had given Beowulf time to throw himself across the floor, scoop up Unferth's blade, and as the hag leapt on top of him, Beowulf reversed the sword and prayed. He felt the beast's weight on his back, felt her hot breath on his neck, and heard cries of triumph. He gritted his teeth and waited for the final blow. But the noise had not been in triumph. It had been her last noise as the sword pierced through her. She lay still, dead. It took much of Beowulf's remaining strength to drag himself from under the monster's corpse, and still more to wrench free Unferth's sword. As he staggered back towards the cave entrance, he noticed another mound on the floor at the side of the vast damp dwelling. It was Grendel, cold and grisly. Knowing the monster's destiny, the jeep brought Unferth's sword down and took his head. Here was the last trophy for Harrow. Beowulf took one great lungful of air and clove the water below the cave, clutching the head in one hand. It was another hard swim, but his heart was lifted, and it seemed only moments before he broke the surface of the water and sucked in the fresh air again. And that is the end of chapter 4. Okay, hopefully you're enjoying the story. I know most of you are, and if you are, join us for chapter 5. If not, don't worry about it. Okay, I'm only reading it so that you can hear the whole story if you want it. Bye.